Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Michael Benedikt, and I am the director for the Center for American Architecture and Design here in Austin, Texas, where I'm also a professor at the School of Architecture. Now, you may think that Sea of Faith New Zealand, the steering committee, has made a mistake inviting me to speak to you, and it's quite possible that by the end of this talk, that's exactly what you think. But their reason was that I have written a book about 8 years ago, which was quite well received, called God is the Good We Do, which is in fact a book of theology, which I think offers some original positions, some original takes on the theological basis of many religions. It was my 8th book, and it was not at all, as I say, about architecture. How did I come to write it? Well, it came after many, many years, basically about 30 years of reflection and reading, and it came possibly because of my background. I am the only son of 2 Holocaust survivors. Both of them spent 4 years in concentration camps. My mother died at 93 in my care at my house. My father is 96 and doing well and living in Sydney. Now, as a young man, we were not a very religious household, and nor were the households they grew up in very religious. And as a young man, in fact, I drifted towards Buddhism like a lot of young men of my generation did. And that was very valuable. It really influenced me a great deal in my thinking about what the theological and religious possibilities were. Now, there are some obvious connections between architecture and religion. Clearly, in the building of churches, mosques, temples of different kinds, the activity of building them was often thought of as itself a sacred activity. It's a little unlike today, where if you build a religious building, the actual builders of the building are not necessarily spiritually charged or spiritually involved in the construction, but let us say even so that they were. This is a clear connection between the act of building anyway and a spiritual practice, or building towards a higher purpose. And then, of course, when the building is done, one looks to it as a place where spiritual energies are gathered, where one might in peace contemplate larger things than one's own life, shall we say. And of course, liturgy and poetry complete the whole picture. So the connection between things religious and things architectural are quite clear. I do, however, think that there are other relationships which certainly I felt and which I tried to convey in the book. And I would start with a thought that comes from possibly the first appearance of God in a certain way in the book of Exodus and in Numbers. Here, God appears. It's described as a cloud. God appears as a cloud that settles upon the tabernacle, in which above the Ark of the Covenant itself, there's a flame burns. So we have the image of a cloud with a flame inside of it. The cloud is not smoke, and the flame, like the one from the burning bush, is not really a flame. The cloud, when the flame is burning and the cloud is settled on the tabernacle, no one may enter, not even Moses. The cloud lifts, and when the cloud lifts and moves, the entire people of Israel had to follow it, and follow it they did. This to me is a quite different vision, and a rather original and quizzical one, because it meant that God in spirit, he was not yet, shall we say, a king, He did not have a consort. He was not surrounded by cherubim and angels. He was a cloud, and the cloud had something burning or alive in it. As I said, the real reason I wrote this book was because I'm Jewish and my parents were Holocaust survivors. For anyone who lived through that, for anyone who thinks about that, one has to ask, how could a God, the God of the Jews, of Christians, and of Muslims, who is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-wise, and all-good, permit it to happen? A God that was all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, and what's more, that created the universe the way it is, would surely not have permitted that crime, shall we say, as well as the many, many, many senseless deaths that have occurred before that and since. In the cool language of philosophy, that's called the problem of evil. The problem of evil is probably the most succinct and pointed argument against belief in God, at least against belief in the kind of God that the scriptures tell us about. My parents, as a result, lost their faith, one have to say. They were irreligious. When they did go to synagogue for friends' weddings, they would go, but my father couldn't do it. Or he would go, and the moment he heard prayers, the moment he heard singing, he would just dissolve into tears and have to leave the room. Because they reminded him of his unfortunate friends who by the hundreds would enter the gas chambers singing those exact songs. It was really just too much for him. Now, I didn't want this lecture, nor do I need this lecture to be my story, much less my parents' story. But as a result of that background, which is why I'm telling you this, I grew up in a household where the questions, who is God, what is God, where is God, and even why is God, hung like a mist in the air, perhaps like a cloud, illuminated by a fire that seemed to me not to hover over a sacred chest or ark or niche or even book, but seemed to come from every ordinary act of love and kindness and wisdom around me. And of these acts, there were many. As you can see, I am recording, and as I said, I'm recording this from my study. In fact, it is my university office. Due to my schedule, I am going to be breaking this talk into several parts at different times, and so you might see me dressed a little differently, and you might see the light around me a little differently, and I would also probably have had different amounts of coffee. So with that, please bear with me. I will be doing my first segment soon. Thank you. With or without God? Community with or without God? Post-theism. It seems to me that the question of this conference is, how can we have community without a theistic God? And the answer to me is it's not clear. That the alternatives to theism, which I would take to be agnosticism, atheism, or deism, have problems. That simply walking away from theism does not necessarily solve. Now, what do I mean by this? I would like to just study for a moment, or go back in time, to the relationship between theology and cosmology, or more technically, cosmogony, i.e. the origins of the universe. There was a time when both religion and science agreed that the origin of the universe, if you could answer the question of how the universe started, you would also be answering the question of who or what God is, or was, let's say. There was a strong affinity between the cosmic questions and theological questions. The universe, so big, so marvelous, so amazing, simply could not be conceived of or imagined as something other than divine. We're all aware of Anselm's proof of God is that greater than which cannot be conceived. And what could be greater than the entire universe through all time and eternity from its beginning? This very soon came to be associated with God. To this day, this is where things stand for many believers and would-be believers, especially religious people who know something about science. And we can look at that from both sides. The theologian who is open to science, the modern theologian, is apt to say, let the physicists, let the astronomers, let the cosmologists continue to ask their questions, because what they will find is that the universe is more mysterious, larger, and more amazing than our early pre-scientific, certainly, inquirers knew. And that counts for us, because the mystery, in fact, will never end. And the reason the mystery will never end is because no one will perceive of the mind of God, shall we say. Everything that science tells us is that the world is more marvelous and ultimately less explicable than we thought it was before. Science, one might say, is like a sphere that expands into the unknown. And like a sphere, the more it grows, the larger the surface area to the unknown grows. The mysteries multiply, they don't disappear. This sense that science proceeds in the face of God, or only enlarges the mystery and immensity of God, is a great consolation to science-friendly theologians. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have the scientists, non-believers, shall we say, not non-committal with respect to standard religion. But the scientists, in a strange way, profit from the inherent, almost intuitive connection between the cosmological and the theological, because they are able to use certain phrases such as the mind of God, the fate of mankind, the end of the universe, the dimension beyond all dimensions, and so forth. They're able to use these quote-unquote scientific terms and allow their pronouncements to be taken to be the pronouncements of prophets. I won't name names here, but you all know several scientists and cosmologists who, shall we say, play free and easy with phrases that in fact belong strongly in the religious tradition. And I don't think it's entirely legitimate, nor do, by the way, do I think it's entirely legitimate that theologians borrow the authority of science to support their faith. Missing from both of those is a third view of God, which one might call the existential or the relational. I'm thinking of the idea of God that one sees in theologians like Martin Buber or Paul Tillich or Levinas, which is of God that is present among us, that is present in the doing of good, in ethicality, in love, in human relationships, to all things, animals, plants, things, and even possibly in relationships of them among others. This God, this is an addressable God for reasons that we can probably get into. This God is here among us, addressable, and infinitely concerned with what we do and say at every moment. Now, this is the God that we read of in the Bible and in the Quran. This is a God that seems to intervene in daily life, that offers guidance and consolation and discipline. It's not a God that is fashionable to believe in now because of, for one, the problem of evil, which we talked about before. And there are various other problems. It seems naive. It's certainly no one is going to believe in a God who's a king above the clouds, all radiant, surrounded by angels, with big booming voice, as he is sometimes described in biblical sources. Very well. So what kind of God do we believe in? Today, most people who will say that they are spiritual but not religious are likely to look to nature. This is deism, shall we say, in another form. That is, if you want to see God, step outside on a starry night. Contemplate how small you are and how magnificent the stars. Or go rafting among the great canyons and look at the handiwork that created the earth. Or marvel at the beauties of nature, or at the intricacy of mathematics, the improbability and gorgeousness of it all. That is where to locate God. Basically, take a walk in nature and be with God that way. Unfortunately, in my view, the deistic God, the God who created the universe, or the God who is simply the designer and creator, does not help you decide whether to stop in the road, not to run over a tortoise crossing the road. Because really, in the great scheme of things, what's one more tortoise? What's one more little tortoise? What is it that stops you from running over that animal? It's something like compassion, and it's something like duty, and it applies to you. I think one has to believe, if you look at the universe, it's a vast, vast and indifferent place, full of exploding stars and vast wastelands of nothingness and energy and chaos. It is here on earth, in this rare and precious place we have, that conscience and love and hesitation and reflection and courage first appear. And I want to claim to you that God himself, herself, itself, that God actually first appears when we do. First appears when we think twice, when we feel that the universe is not just a gigantic machine, but that it has goodness in it, that it has moments where we are called to make judgments. That, I would claim, is where God arises and first begins. So you know from the premise of my talk and possibly the title of my book that I'm someone who believes that God exists. And I wanted to spend a few minutes actually trying to unpack the idea, not so much of God at this time, but the idea of existing. When we say something exists, we usually have something quite concrete in mind. Trees, chairs, planets exist, animals, These are all bounded objects. They persist. They keep their shape in time. They're somehow complete in themselves. And they give us the most obvious sense of what it means to exist. This chair exists, this table exists, you exist, and I exist. It's this sense of existence that atheists will refuse for God, and probably for good reason. However, we also know that there are other forms of existence. For example, even within the physical realm, we could think about something like the atmosphere. Air that surrounds the planet, Earth, and ask ourselves, where does the atmosphere end? We know that there's no atmosphere in outer space. We know that there's atmosphere, air, here on Earth. But it's actually quite indistinct where the atmosphere finally ends. It's obviously a sort of a gradation. The same is true of even more entity-like objects like clouds. Clouds change their shape all the time. They vary, they melt away, they form and condense. Smoke is the same sort of thing. Those are perfectly physical things. And we have words for them, nouns for them, we can point to them. But they do not have distinct and concrete boundaries. So even within the purely physical realm, there is no problem with talking about the existence of unbounded or slightly or transforming things. Waves, for example, are another. Now, there's yet another kind, which is totally invisible. For example, we would say that gravity exists, or that the electromagnetic field exists. Things like gravity and the electromagnetic field, from radio through heat and light and so forth, permeate the universe. A lot of them run completely through physical objects. For example, the electromagnetic field. It's completely physical and incontestable, and there's mathematics that applies to it. We would have no problem saying the electromagnetic field exists. A theologian trying to say in what sense God exists obviously now has some choices, at least a modern theologian does. And someone like Paul Tillich, for example, when saying that God was the invisible ground of being, had something very much like a field in mind, the electromagnetic or the gravitational field. And it rather beautifully describes the sense in which God or deity, divinity, is not to be sort of located or overly personified, or overly literally personified, shall we say. Now, there are other styles of existence still. Imagine, let's talk about thoughts and feelings. Thoughts and feelings exist. We give them names. In fact, we're very good at naming varieties of thought and feeling and describing them. But where are they? Where do they exist? We will say metaphorically in our hearts. What of course we mean is in our minds, in our brains. And in fact, there are theologians who say that's where God is, in your brain. God is a thought, shall we say. The interesting thing about thoughts and ideas and feelings is that at that point, people will often talk about, well, you know, a brain is not a mind, and a soul is not a personality, shall we say. That mind and matter are quite different, and that one should not confuse the two, and that certainly God does not belong to matter, but rather to mind, or possibly to some conflation or unity of mind and matter. I want to leave those arguments aside for a moment and concentrate on something else about thoughts and feelings. What's interesting about thoughts and feelings is that they are, interesting to me I should say, is that they are episodic. What do I mean by that? Take a feeling like jealousy. What causes jealousy? What causes that feeling of jealousy? It's very, very painful. The feeling that a friend or a lover is attracted to someone else. You obsess about it. If you have been so unfortunate as to feel that feeling, you know that it is obsessive. Suddenly the virtue of loyalty seems very important to you. All you can think about is where the other person is or who they're with. It takes hold of you completely. And yet, no two people will have the feel. It's a completely familiar feeling, but no two people have it for the same reasons. That is, what causes you to be jealous and what causes me to be jealous are entirely different. And yet there's something universal about the feeling of jealousy. We can speak about it to each other, we can recognize it in each other, and we can try to understand it. But it is not tied into any universal jealousy field. There's no such thing. Nor is there a central source of jealousy that we're all tapped into, like an electrical outlet that goes to a power station. Jealousy, and shall I say now, love, and many of our other thoughts and feelings arise in us commonly. I would say the metaphor here, or the analogy, is rather like fire. How many fires are burning all over the world today, from cigarette butts to explosions to burning buildings to fires in hearths and so forth? All these fires are distinct. They're not connected together in any way. They were not caused by the same central fire, shall we say. But fire is fire, and it is the same everywhere. Now that is the sense in which I say we should think about God's existence. That God is the good we do, that God actually comes to life or burns like a fire wherever there is fire, and not where there is not. God is the good we do. God is not everything we do, just the good we do, and is episodic in that sense. I realize this flies in the face of other claims we want to make about God as the eternal presence and as the creator. But I ask you to consider, and I will try to explore with you a little bit, what it means to think of as God as a flame, often a hand-cupped and tender flame that requires cherishing and care, and not necessarily as a destructive, or ever really as a destructive flame, but that comes a little later. I do want to try to get this right, and if you would permit me, I'm going to read from chapter 4 of my book for about 5 minutes or so. Won't make very interesting video, but possibly the accuracy of my words will compensate. So thank you. Now, the variety of existence I just spoke about is something worth discussing a little more. And it ought not to be foreign to us, except as it is applied to God. There are hundreds of things that we happily refer to using nouns, which are not really things, objects, or people, or feelings, or ideas and abstract universals like numbers and laws, or even spiritual beings like angels or ghosts. They are, rather, patterns, and among them are patterns of human activity or behavior. What else is a team? What else is a home? Over and above a house, a prayer, or a bank? What else is love? What else is community? And where, might we ask, do these patterns exist? Only in the mind? Try telling that to a rugby player or an American football quarterback. Patterns come and go. They become vivid and fade, emerge and dissipate. but they're no less objective for it. You might as well ask, where does your fist go when you open your hand? Or where does your lap go when you stand up? Where do the games of tennis, football, or bridge go when the playing of them is over? Where does love go? We cannot answer, of course, and should not need to. Fists and laps and games in play are patterns. They are what you might call configurational entities, spatiotemporal arrangements of other elements that for a while, or repeatedly, or forever, create something stable and deserving of a name. What else is a flame or a room? What is a wedding, a trial, a meal, a smile? These are complex patterns of things, events, and behaviors, configurational entities that evaporate once they are over, and their parts go back to some other arrangement, parts that are themselves arrangements or patterns with their own cycles of formation and dissolution. If you understand the sense in which patterns of human behavior exist, then you understand the sense in which the theology of theopraxy proposes that God exists. And need I add, present patterns massively affect future ones. Now, when believers offer that their faith is not based on reason, but on direct personal experience of God, let us even call it contact with God, it is usually in one of two distinct modes that the believer will speak. In one mode, the believer has a vision, something like Isaiah 6. God in heaven, on his throne, or standing, but radiant always, with beneficence, love, and power, breaking into this world like sunshine through clouds. Or one sees a marvelous apparition like an angel, or hears a voice from nowhere addressing one specifically and personally. The believer comes away from an experience like this feeling awe, blessedness, redemption, chosen to be one of a line of very few people who have experienced God directly: Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Isaiah, Jonah, Jesus, a prophet, maybe a saint. In the second mode of contact, however, the believer simply has an experience of the profound rightness and beauty of certain constellations of events, things or actions around them. These events, things, or actions are momentarily seen in a new light, as a part of an eternal and lovely whole, in patterns never to be replicated, and yet somehow fully intended. The sounds of nature or of music might resonate with profounder harmonies. If the believer hears God's voice, it is as the voice of a friend, or as his or her own voice. One comes away from experiences like this with feelings of gratitude, of clarity, and of hope. Have the first experience, or trust that others have had it, and you will report belief in a biblical or Neoplatonic transcendent God who presides over this world from another plane of existence. Have the second experience, or trust that others have had it, and you will report belief in an immanent God, soaked into this world, manifesting himself, herself, or itself more or less powerfully in 1,000 activities and actualities all around. Mainstream Western faiths have based themselves largely on the first experience of God. Deism, pantheism, panentheism base themselves largely on the second. The theology of theopraxy bases itself on something like the second experience too, but only when it is caused by the works and deeds of people. These people may be inspired by the first experience of God, or the second, or neither, or both. It is only necessary that they could have done something else, something less loving, less lovely, less good, less true. In my view, neither the stars nor the moon nor the twitter of the rainforest proves that God exists. But a bowl of soup, a loving hand, a genuine smile, a beautiful room, a pardon given, do. These things. I'd like to go back to considering the problem of evil. If you remember, this came up in my opening remarks, because the problem of evil, which is really the problem of the existence of evil at all. It's not like saying the problem of government corruption or the problem of pollution. All of these can be solved. But the problem of evil that I want to talk about is the name given to the problem for monotheists, for how it is that ill fortune and human evil can exist at all in a world in which God the Creator is also all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. Trying to reconcile the all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God with the existence of evil has been the largest single obstacle to rational faith. And of course, as you might expect, and as you probably know as well as I do, there have been several explanations offered of how it is possible to keep some concept of a traditional Western God and still account for the presence of evil. Of course, no, this is not really a problem for systems that have many gods. In a many-god or a polytheistic system, one simply says, well, you know, the gods are in charge of different things and they don't always get along. And so when they fight with each other, their affairs spill over into human affairs. So the problem is about the unity of God and how it is that, again, an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing Creator God could countenance evil. So I'd like to go through 3 explanations that have been offered, and then I'm going to go back and critique each, and I'm going to wonder whether the theology of theopraxy escapes any of them, and if so, how. I would call the first explanation of the problem of evil the totality explanation. Now, what is the totality explanation? It goes something like this. God sees all. He knows all, from eternity in the future to eternity in the past, and that everything that happens is part of that grand picture. And it's a grand picture which is beautiful and excellent, and only looks evil to us or looks bad to us because of our limited perspective. So everything bad that happens is really part of a larger plan. This is a very comforting belief, and there are times when I myself come very close to thinking that had better be the case, because otherwise this is not intolerable. This is not tolerable, I should say. The second explanation that's often offered for the presence of evil in a world governed by God is called the freedom explanation. And in that, one argues that in order for humans to be human, they need freedom. Or you say God's freedom is absolute, and that humankind is made in the image of God. We therefore share in God's freedom. God's greatest gift to us is our freedom. And our freedom is meaningless unless that freedom includes the freedom to do bad and to do evil. That's what it means for us to be free. One would say then that God's greatest gift to humans is freedom, even over and above goodness. The final explanation, which I call the finite knowledge explanation, borrows elements of the first two, but it's a little different in that it says the following. We can never know enough to do good. We don't know what our deeds are going to turn out to do. We're not always sure which principles to use. We have finite knowledge, even of very, very earthly things. We have finite scientific knowledge, finite moral knowledge. It's not a matter of can we know the entire universe in perpetuity? Not at all. We don't even know what's going on in our own households. Nor do we really know what the best actions would be. The fact is, we're stupid, we're ignorant, we're going to make mistakes. And God did not see fit to giving us perfect finite knowledge, even though we did eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We obviously did not eat enough of it. So there we have three explanations. I'd like now to maybe talk about how these explanations work or don't, and how do they succeed. So let's look at the totality explanation. I would have to say that the totality explanation tends to undermine the traditional God's omnibenevolence. What it's saying is that in order to make an omelet, God has to break some eggs. In order for the larger good to happen, someone must suffer. God cannot change the laws of that. And in fact, we might not understand God at all. He might even have a touch of evil in God, in him, her, it. Call it what you will. This reduces the omnibenevolence, or all good aspect of God, so it can't really be perceived or put forward as a solution to the problem of evil. Let's look at the freedom, that God's greatest gift is freedom. We might say, look, so God puts choices in front of us and waits for us to choose well. I like to think of that as in an analogy. Let's say God places a buffet in front of us with 50 dishes to eat. We can choose any of them. 4 of them, however, are poisonous. 4 of them will kill you. Why is it necessary that 4 should kill you? I would say 46 dishes is enough freedom. We wouldn't actually probably notice the difference, quite frankly. It's within God's power, in the traditional sense, to put 46 pretty good dishes in front of us, none of which will do that much harm. This either challenges God's ability or his willingness to place before us only pretty good choices, because we would still have freedom even in that case. On the finite knowledge, the fact that we are merely human, one would have to ask the following, again, another analogy. Let's say a young nephew of yours, a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, was going to come to visit your house. How would you prepare your house? You would probably get all poisons out of the kitchen cabinets, put gates across the stairs, remove sharp objects and fragile objects. You do everything you could to make the world safe. But would that work? Probably not. So you would hover nearby to swoop in to save this kid from himself. It just seems that God could do the same, knowing our limitations and knowing the necessity even of our limitations. An all-powerful God would be there to save us from ourselves, swooping in at the right moment. Of course, we must see that God does not do that. So we have here in these three challenges to the omnibenevolent, all-powerful, all-knowing God, and even to the deistic version of a God who has made the world the way it is, and perhaps left it to us. We have in there the most significant challenge that one can have to the idea of a monotheistic God. Something, I believe, about our ordinary beliefs about God has to give. One or two, or perhaps all three of these properties of God, let's say four if you include his creatorship, would have to be modified. The theology of theopraxy makes its choice. God, it says, is not all-powerful or all-knowing, but he is all-good. And because we are the ones that do good or not, his very existence depends on us. He is in our hands, and we are in his through each other. Stop. Wait, says the atheist. There's nothing miraculous or wonderful about human morality. It derives from evolution, from a social biological evolution. Whatever it is we call good is simply ideas or actions or even people that have helped human life proliferate on Earth. Goodness is entirely relative to what life form is being promoted. In this case, we prefer human morality because it promotes human life. All ideas about goodness can be tied to an evolutionary process. Now, I don't think that's wrong. I just think that's one-eyed. For example, you could explain a storm in Texas, my home state, as what happens when warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico meets a cold front coming down from Canada. When that happens, water condenses, water droplets by the quadrillion condense at the interface and fall to Earth, and that's what we call rain. There's nothing wrong with that explanation, but it doesn't begin to describe what it's like to be caught in a thunderstorm in Texas and to have yourself drenched and to feel the water seeping up your socks. Similarly, when it comes to cooking, there's a science to cooking. There's knowing the history of cuisine. There's knowing what happens to carbohydrates and proteins when heated in this way and in that. No good chef can do without that knowledge. On the other hand, it really takes being able to sip a beautiful soup or sauce off a spoon, or to feel, smell the fragrance of a perfectly roasted chicken, or to tell good garlic from bad oneself, to understand that the experience of the food and the experience of the cooking is the other side of the scientific coin. These are not dueling explanations, they're simply dual explanations. In the same sense, explaining that goodness evolves, or that goodness arises from witless life on earth becoming perhaps conscious through us is not a demerit towards understanding a deeper fact, which is that evolution in progress feels to us like life as lived, that one explanation needs the other. When we talk about God as the good we do, and we enable ourselves to understand that we use the word God in a way that refers to thousands of years of metaphor and poetry and figuration and thought about who or what God is or what might be. And we bring it all down to life as lived, to the good we do. We see that God's very body, His very essence, exists in our thoughts and in our hands. I would like to read one more time to try to get this feeling across, or these thoughts across, in the most precise way. So if you'd permit me. Evolutionary, biological, and even humanistic explanations of where morality comes from challenge traditional belief in God, but they support the theology of theopraxy entirely. When God is a production of human experience, as real as color, or music, or law, or democracy, and is closer than the vein in your neck, which is actually how Muhammad put it, then God's mystery and wonder do not depend on revelation in the biblical sense. No voices from thin air, no angelic light, no ladders into the clouds are necessary. It's simply the wonder of being touched by ethical action firsthand, up close. Here is a child offering her blood for transfusion into her sick brother. Here is a man risking his life to lead a dog off a busy road. There is a woman anonymously channeling her wealth to charity. There is a man steadily forbearing insults to himself and offering goodwill in return. On such occasions, a familiar amalgam of emotions are elicited. Awe, gratitude, joy, hope, pride in being human. Just as the experience of being scalded by hot water is not nullified by knowing that it is actually billions of fast-moving molecules battering the nerve endings under our skin, so the wonder of goodness is not at all undone and is perhaps intensified by knowing that it emerged from billions of years of selfish, witless life on earth, becoming conscious, the light of stars becoming light of a different sort. I think this, and the mystery, or think this, I should say, and the mystery and wonder of God can come from something as simple as the pleasure of realizing that one is alive, free, without pain, and at the same time of benefit to others who deserve the same experience. And who deserves that experience? Every baby born. The truth is that some measure of goodness is all around us. Every iota of tact, every laugh among friends, every moment of patience and offering of help is an instance of God. Every obedience to law, every washing of hands, every feeding of a pet, every letting someone sleep is God at work. This is what it means to know that God is immanent and in our hands. That we can walk peaceably and work respectfully among other people, that we can tolerate their foibles and expect the same from them, are miracles that do not appear miraculous, because they are, quote unquote, normal. And they are normal because they are built upon millennia of learning and transmission of the Word of God, or in the Oriental tradition, the way of heaven, which itself evolves over time. We need only contemplate with the existentialists our ever-present freedom to do almost anything, including lie, murder, steal, dishonor, and abandon, to see that good doing is always up to us, that it is always a choice, and a choice of which we can be later proud, even if we weren't fully aware at the time that we were choosing. Recall the hells on earth that dot human history. Bring to mind the ones that exist right now, somewhere out of the planet, somewhere on the planet. Now look out the window. Every bird not shot, every walker not carrying a gun, every car waiting patiently at a traffic light to change, every repairman writing up a job fairly, every person dying in a fresh hospital bed instead of on the battlefield or in a gutter, every street that is swept, every bush that is trimmed, every toddler studying a worm is God, evidenced and instanced. Look upon these things and be glad. Rejoice at peace and decency. See that for the most part your cup runneth over, and more, that by your actions you are one reason that the cup runs over for others. Call that the wonder of doing. The wonder of doing, Abraham Joshua Heschel said, and now I'm quoting him, is no less amazing than the marvel of being, and it may prompt us to discover the divinity of deeds. In doing sacred deeds, we may begin to realize there is more in our doing than ourselves. Then in our doing there is something, nay, someone divine. Through the ecstasy of deeds, it is through the ecstasy of deeds that we learn to be certain of the here-ness of God. I would like to thank the Sea of Faith New Zealand Steering Committee under Laurie Chisholm for inviting me to speak. Thank you so much for giving me your time. Thanks also to Jock Crawford, Noel Cheer, Peter Crowley, and especially Norm Eli, who kept me on track by email, phone, and Skype. Thank you, Norm. My greetings to you, Sir Lloyd Gearing. I've been an admirer of yours for really decades now, and I would so love to have met you and had some tea. Greta Vosper, I've watched you lecture online, and I've read your book, With and Without God, which makes many of the same points I do, but much better. And to Dr. Troughton, I would very much like to have met you as well. Dear audience who've been watching me for an hour now, thank you for your attention. I tried to outline a faith that sustains me and possibly a few hundred other people. You know, I'm not in the business of creating religions. For me, and I hope for you, theopraxy is a way of practicing any religion within its own terms. Its liturgy, its images, its narratives, which really have incomparable power, and not for their truth value, but for the good that they are capable in bringing out of us. No matter how we get to the point of accountability, no matter how we recognize our freedom ethically, the fact is that God's welfare is up to us, just as our welfare is up to God's. God is the good I do. God is the good you do. God is the good we do and they do in the face of our freedom, all of our freedom, to do otherwise. God is good being done. And I am sure that God is with us, between us, and among us right now. Thank you.